Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Ken Greene. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Government here at UT Austin and an affiliate of the Strauss Center that is sponsoring today's event. It challenges in US, Mexico, Central America policy at the beginning of the Biden administration. And originally it was going to be hosted by Stephanie Leutert from the Strauss Center, who was the director of Central America and Mexico policy initiatives. But she was called away to help work on these challenges. She is now working as a senior advisor for migration policy at the State Department. We have a fantastic guest with us today to talk about these challenges. And Joy Olson, that is, of course. The world of US Latin America policy is ever more complex, and there are really quite a few dilettantes working in this field and few experts. Joy Olson is not just among the few experts, she's the person that the experts turn to for advice. And in fact, the US Congress has asked for her advice and analysis on 7 occasions. For 13 years, she directed this very influential NGO in Washington called the Washington Office on Latin America, or as it's better known, WOLA. She's worked on policy related to a variety of issues: poverty and inequality, drug trafficking, immigration, Central American peace accords, humanitarian aid to Cuba, and US security assistance to countries throughout the region. Currently, she's helping a variety of NGOs get their act together, and she's thinking a lot about US policy toward Latin American countries. She also writes a column for Mexico Today, which is an English language publication published in Mexico by a Mexican newspaper, Reforma. Today, she's going to speak for 30 minutes, more or less, and then we'll have about 25 minutes left for questions and answers. This is a webinar style, so I'll ask you to type your questions using the Q&A button or tab on the bottom of your Zoom. I'll then read the questions and Joy can respond. So let's get started. I'm very eager to hear. Welcome, Joy Olson.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Are we good? All right. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm talking from Wisconsin. I told someone I'm giving a class in Texas today. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I have respected the programs at UT Austin for forever. You all have some of the best people and the best resources on Latin America that there are in this country. So kudos to you. So my challenge today is to talk about the challenges in US, Mexico, and Central America policy right now at the beginning of the Biden administration. I think in a good academic vein, I'm going to start out by defining my terms. Mostly, I'm going to be focusing on the northern triangle countries of Central America: Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. In terms of US policy toward the region, Nicaragua gets kind of lumped in with Venezuela usually. Costa Rica and Panama aren't considered too much of a problem, so they sort of fall by the wayside. And then there's Belize, and we just don't even remember the Belizes in Central America. So for the purpose of this conversation, I'm mostly focused on the Northern Triangle countries. We're coming out of the Trump administration, and the Trump administration, I would say, had a kind of a single issue relationship with Mexico. And that issue was migration. And its strategy was pretty singular as well. It was a maximum pressure strategy on Mexico to get them to control the flow not only of Mexicans, but mostly of Central Americans into the US. You know, the Trump administration threatened Mexico's trade status with the US, and that among other things, it got Mexico to move the National Guard to the southern border, basically kind of moving the US border farther south in migration terms to Mexico's southern border with Guatemala. And, you know, I think that one of the most important things that conceptually happened around migration during this period is that Mexico proved that it could stem the flow of Central Americans to the United States. And I was talking with a friend, a Mexican friend, who said, you know, that's one of the most important things that happened, because Mexico had never been willing to you know, use the military to stop migrants from coming up until that point. And it's kind of like the genie that can't be put back in the bottle. So the US knows now Mexico can do it if it really wants to, and that it's a shadow that is cast over the whole policy relationship at this point. So we had that happening. We had the National Guard moving to the border. The caravans were coming up from Central America during the Trump administration. Again, a part of this whole singular issue, maximum pressure strategy. Aid to the U.S. suspended aid to Central America, and then did some other things, but basically was pretty successful in really lowering the flow of Central Americans to the US. Now, the most effective strategy lately has been to, which started last year, which it's called Article 42. And basically what that does is say that because of COVID, the US is not going to let asylum seekers cross into the US, and that anybody who crosses over illegally just gets pushed right back into Mexico. And so that's the, you know, kind of that's the environment here at the beginning, at the border, at the beginning of the Biden administration. One other thing I want to say about Central America, because I think this was incredibly important during the Trump years, is that while the US had been incredibly supportive of anti-corruption efforts in Central America, important ones had been established in Guatemala and in Honduras. The US completely backed away from those efforts, and they fell apart. It took a long time to create them. They were quite effective in Guatemala. They were starting to be in Honduras. Because they were effective, local elites really were not very happy that they existed. And US political support for those anti-corruption bodies was incredibly important to their existence. And when the US stopped backing them, that those efforts fell apart. So, as I said in the beginning, you know, we're coming at this from kind of this single issue conceptualization, but the other big issue, of course, which is around us every day, but important to acknowledge, is COVID. And you know, everybody wants to know what the long-term impact is going to be from this COVID period, not just in terms of public health, but, you know, what is this going to mean in all of our lives, right? And I think that there's one thing that we know, that poverty and inequality have become much worse, not just in the United States, but throughout the hemisphere. And that's really important to keep in mind here as we move into this next period of the Biden administration. So what do we know about the Biden administration and on Latin America? We know that Biden was Obama's point person on Latin America, and he was also put in charge of kind of managing the unaccompanied minor flow that, I mean, there've been unaccompanied minors coming to the US for many, many years. It was back, I believe in 2014 when there was a large flow of Central American migrants, and Biden was very involved in that. So all of that's to say is that he's traveled to Latin America a lot. He knows the issues. He's been responsible for the issues from the level of the presidency. And the other thing that we know is that as we look at people who have been appointed to key positions, especially key positions in the White House, so the National Security Council and a few others, the Biden administration has put in people who were in the Obama administration. So we know we've seen how policy was executed under the same set of actors a number of years ago. So we all learn things over time, but we have a general sense of how they think, and it's pretty similar to what we saw in the Obama administration. All right, what do we know about Biden on Central America? Biden's intentions on Central America. Well, he published a whole paper on this, or the campaign did back during the campaign. And I'll pull up a link to it at the end here. I'm gonna pull up a document that's called resources and make some links in case anybody wants to screenshot that at the very end of the talk. So Biden laid out his kind of the main points of his approach to Central America in this document that was put out during the campaign. And there's already legislation that is being formulated in Congress. The basic draft is out there. I don't think it's been introduced yet, but it contains these points of focus. So those are much more discussion about the root causes of migration, a greater commitment to funding efforts that address root causes. You'll remember that I was just saying that the Trump administration cut off aid to Central America. So this is taking a radically different approach. It's the amount that they're talking about is about $1 billion a year, so $4 billion over 4 years. There is a good deal of focus on corruption issues. So anti-corruption is key. Rule of law programming, so functioning justice systems and public security systems. Poverty alleviation is in there. And then a private investment as well, encouraging private investment. Well, two things. One, there's a point that many of the people like me who've worked on Central America for a long time are feel like it's the lesson we have learned over time, and that is that corruption is a huge problem in Central America, and so I would say that while this is a big aid package, there is also a real kind of intense focus on not just throwing money at this problem, because we feel like the movie we've seen before is that you do throw money, the US government has funded programs and they haven't addressed some of the fundamental corruption issues, which I think feed hopelessness, which in turn feeds migration. And so there is an undercurrent of anti-corruption that's both in this approach and I think in the concern of a lot of people who want to be supportive of Central America, but not at any cost. Let's see. The other thing, a point I would just make is that while while the Biden plan is looking at a four-year strategy and funding over a four-year period, the U.S. funds everything. Our Congress works, on an annual budget, so we fund things year to year. So we're just not very good at doing anything long-term when it comes to the execution of this kind of program or even philosophy. All right. So I want to move on now to Mexico. And I just talked about what we know about Biden. And now I'd like to talk about what we know about Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, the president of Mexico. One thing we definitely know about him is that he's a nationalist. And while they had this incredibly while the relationship was fraught and the U.S. Pressured Mexico a great deal, AMLO seemed to not mind dealing with Trump. And I think that's something that we're going to see a real change. Anyway, in ways that are strange. We're going to see how AMLO dealt with Trump versus how he deals with Biden, and I think that this point of nationalism, that Trump was a real nationalist, and so is AMLO, is going to play itself out in some really interesting ways. Sovereignty has and will continue to be a central issue for AMLO. You'll recall that he didn't recognize President Biden right away after he was elected. He waited until the Electoral College had declared, which kind of sets him off on a little bit. Well, people say it sets him off on rocky footing with the Biden administration, but there were other things that were rocky as well. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. The Mexico-U.S. relationship continues to be really asymmetric. The U.S. can hurt Mexico either intentionally or unintentionally, way more than Mexico seems to be able to hurt the U.S. So that's another undercurrent in AMLO's relationship with the United States. When AMLO came into office, he talked a lot about having a different kind of relationship with migrants and with Central America. It was, in the beginning, it was not seeing migrants as a threat. It was seeing them as basically fellow disadvantaged people who were, Mexico would work to help support in the sense of not seeing them as criminals, basically, not criminalizing migration. However, when the US started threatening Mexico, that whole approach to the region went out the window. While Mexico had talked about doing things like development programs that involved Central America, they really didn't ever materialize. And actually, we learned that some of the money that they had talked about spending on that ended up being used to deport Central Americans. So there's that. What else do we know about AMLO? We know that, again, as a nationalist at heart, he doesn't like to be criticized. He doesn't like to be criticized by people outside of Mexico. So the idea that Biden comes in with an agenda that is vocally expressive of human rights issues or supportive of ideas like green energy, I think there will be, there's not going to be tremendous receptivity to ideas coming from the U.S. that are seen as this is a U.S. idea and it's being pushed on to Mexico. The counter drug situation right now is pretty dicey with the Mexican government. You may recall that in the end of the fall, there was a general whose name was Cienfuegos, who was detained at LAX and accused of being involved in drug trafficking. And in the end, Mexico, AMLO completely went to bat for the general. The general got returned to Mexico. And in the end, Mexico decided not to file charges against him. You know, that was the one place where we saw AMLO really, what would you say, really push back against the US. So a few other things. Let me look at my time here. So for the United States going into this moment with Mexico, migration is an enormous issue. So much of Trump's rhetoric, at least, was around the border, and then the actions were in constraining both asylum seekers and undocumented migrants from coming into the US. But for the Biden people, while they didn't agree with how Trump was handling immigration, they also really see migration as a potential spoiler issue for them. So so they're really worried about, like, for example, if they just let in all the asylum seekers who have been waiting in Mexico to come into the US, if they just change the law from one day to the next and let them in, they fear that it would encourage a great flow of migrants from Central America. And I think what they even fear more is that it would produce a visual that would be used by the Republicans to undermine the domestic agenda of the Biden administration. So I think that they see the border and border issue, the migration issue at the border, as a potential spoiler for other things that they want to do. And I think that's one reason they're going to be pretty slow in changing policies at the border. And you'll notice that the Biden administration has not changed these COVID restrictions at the border, where asylum seekers and other undocumented people are being pushed right back into Mexico because under the guise of protecting us against COVID, even though most people think that that's not actually as big of a concern as they're making it out to be. So yesterday there was a virtual meeting between AMLO and Biden. There is a joint statement between the two presidents, and I have a link to that on the slide I'll show you in just a second. They talked about cooperation on migration. So what was on the list, right? On the list of things that they were willing to put on paper as a joint declaration was cooperation on migration, defining what they were looking for as orderly, safe, and regular migration. So that's the goal they're going for, is to try and get a system that's functional. I think that's a good thing. And they agreed about working on root causes of migration in Central America. They also talked about response and recovery from COVID. Most of that section of this brief document is about economic recovery issues. So they reaffirmed the US-Mexico's Canada trade agreement, and they talked about restarting the high-level economic dialogue between the two countries. And then, and I'm pretty sure this was put on by the Biden people, there is a small section on climate, although the text of it is very light. But those were the three topics that were on the agenda. So let's talk about opportunities for a second. I think that any opportunities for progress on issues of mutual concern will have to be framed in a way that is not offensive to the sovereignty concerns on the Mexican side. So that's kind of point one. I think that there is real opportunity and desire to get at these immigration issues. And I do like the framing that they used in this joint statement of orderly, safe, and regular. It's like there have to be orderly, safe, and regular normal channels for migration. And I think that there's a real will on both sides to see progress made there. I also think there's a potential on environmental issues, but I think the framing of the environmental stuff is going to be really, again, really important. It can't be put forward in a way that is, imposing at all by the United States. One other issue where I think there's, well, two other issues. One where I haven't heard talked about much publicly, but I think there could be some real opportunity for progress is on gun trafficking issues. I mean, this has been on the agenda. Mexico has brought this up repeatedly, repeatedly for like decades with the United States. The United States has done very little. It tends to continually fall into the kind of list of NRA issues that elected officials are afraid of in the United States. But I think what people aren't talking about too much is that the NRA is just a lot weaker than it used to be. And I think that there might be the possibility to pursue a little more control of gun trafficking into Mexico. The other thing is that we're far enough away from the Fast and Furious scandal that I think there's new opportunity opening up there. And the other, where there's clearly common interest, but nobody has been very good at this. The Obama administration wasn't, basically in the past 50 years, nobody's been very good at this. It's on figuring out how to develop an intermestic or a domestic and international agenda on drug policy that deals with the fact that the U.S. is consuming massive amounts of drugs, that the consumption of drugs causes tremendous harm, as well as the trafficking of drugs, and then the criminalization of all of this drug activity produces all kinds of damage as well. I think there's definitely interest in a different kind of agenda. I hope progress is made in that area, but it's really hard. All right, just lastly, there will be another Summit of the Americas coming up probably this fall. And that is a place where you'll see framing, kind of regionalized framing of some of these issues. And then, yeah, I guess the last thing I was going to say was, if we can get to a point where we were all talking about migration issues in the orderly and normal fashion, like, what am I trying to get at? I'm trying to get at the question of what's a crisis, right? And there has been a mixed flow of migrants and asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border for the past 50 years. And I think if we could get to a point where we could sort of admit what's normal, in a way that we can actually identify when there is a crisis, yeah, and have the tools to deal with what I think is a flow that goes up and down over time and keeps repeating itself. We would all just be much healthier, and the politics and the relationship would be much healthier. So I'm going to just share my screen here. I had a few slides on let's see. I had a few slides on border numbers, which I think I've kind of gotten past those. If somebody's interested in, I can go over them. But here are the resources that I wanted to share with you. So this is, the first is a document from the Congressional Research Service, which is a great overview piece. The second is Biden's Back from the Campaign, their strategy document on Central America. The next is and this is where, oops, I'm sorry, didn't mean to do that. This is where you want to, this is where you could go to find charts on migration that are regularly updated. And oh gosh, I'm sorry, this got screwed up there. That, but which is then followed by this joint declaration yesterday from the White House. I realized I messed up this slide and I apologize for that. But if you go down to the second to the last link, that is where the statement is from yesterday's meeting between the two presidents. And then lastly is a draft version of the congressional document that is basically implementing what the Biden administration wants to do on Central America. So I will leave it at that and pass it back to Keith.
Thank you very much, Joy. Would you mind ending the screen share?
Not at all.
Excellent. Thank you. I can see again. All right. We have a few questions lined up. Please give us more. And before we get to those, I'd like to pose kind of a broad one, if you don't mind. Do you see a vision coming out of the Biden administration for Mexico and Central America policy? A vision that, so it seems like before the Trump administration, we were moving with fits and starts toward a particular vision of North America as an economic unit, as a security unit, and to some extent there was an emerging consensus about immigration, although that was I think vaguer than the others, and there was a sense of that the countries would kind of rise and fall together as the U.S. started dealing more with a dynamic Chinese economy. Following the Trump administration, clearly a lot of that's been thrown into disarray. And I kind of hope that yesterday, was it the meeting yesterday or the day before? I've lost track of the days between Biden and AMLO. I was thinking that we might get the architecture of some broad vision for bringing sort of bringing us back to this sort of a path. And it really doesn't sound like it so far. I mean, it might emerge, maybe it's bubbling in the background. Maybe, the State Department is working on ideas that will be coming out in some grand way. But it really seems like the administrations have a lot of points of contention and are moving in opposite directions. I mean, we have AMLO on energy policy, moving in a direction that antagonizes, some U.S. businesses, some domestic business in Mexico, that is contrary to Biden's announced environmental policies. We have the security problems, some of which you mentioned about the Cienfuegos kind of disaster, which I think has really eroded trust on both sides of the border. And Mexico is now moving to restrict the ability of U.S. agencies to help in certain kind of security related concerns, especially with fighting drug trafficking. And then we have this ongoing sort of quagmire about immigration issues. So it feels like the tensions are really very, very present, and that we don't necessarily have an overarching vision, but I just could be missing it. And I'm wondering if you sense that there's something there that will be bubbling up soon.
Well, I think that there are still people who want to have the vision that you've described and who still individually have it. I think the context is not, it's not being put out there in that as an architecture. In particular, it wouldn't be well received within Mexico. And analysts were comparing the talk. There were conversations between Trudeau and Biden right before the conversations between AMLO and Biden, and they were comparing the differences in what they talked about and more about tech issues and collaboration and I just don't think that the current political environment is one that feeds this North American cooperation concept. And so I don't think the idea has gone away, but I think it's backburnered.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me go to some of the questions posed by those tuning in, and please send more. Toward the end, you mentioned a very interesting issue, gun trafficking. And so we know that the vast majority of the firearms in Mexico that are used and recovered from crimes can be traced to the US. And so there's this sort of sense that illegal drugs flow north and firearms flow south. And obviously this is has been the third rail of American politics. So the question that's come to us is, has there ever been any type of control on the export of firearms from the US to Mexico? And what really could be done now? What do you have in mind now that the NRA is at least comparatively on the ropes compared to where it has been over the past decade or more?
I think there are a number of things that could be done, and some of them look like they're directly Mexico related, and some of them don't. They look more like domestic US policy on gun control that could be helpful on the Mexican with trafficking into Mexico. I think that control a lot of guns that end up in Mexico, I think are probably the result of gun show sales. Greater restrictions there. There definitely could be more aggressive prosecution of cases there in the US. There could be let's see, the last time I looked at this, there was a whole series of domestic policy agenda items. You could do more inspections of vehicles going south. I mean, all of that is left to Mexico to try and prevent. But I think that just doing better enforcement issues, but better enforcement on the US side of the border in the border states could be greatly beneficial on the trafficking issues to Mexico.
Thank you. A couple of questions are related to the potential for aid packages to the Northern Triangle countries in Central America. And so in general, what do you see as possible within the context of the Biden administration, given the forces in domestic politics? And to what extent might those packages be tied to anti-corruption measures? And of course, what would those anti-corruption measures even look like?
I think that it's likely that there is a significant aid package to Central America. I think that there is the appetite in Congress to do it, and the understanding that root causes of migration don't go away without being addressed. So I think that's very probable. I think that anti-corruption, I know that anti-corruption language and support will be written into them. What kinds of things can you do? Well, one of the things that was present in Guatemala for a long time was something called the CICIG, which was basically an international commission to investigate impunity in Guatemala. And it had most of the cases, basically it was a UN body that accompanied the public prosecutor's office on the investigation and prosecution of organized crime cases that involve state infiltration. And that kind of entity, while I don't think the CCC will come back into existence in Guatemala, there are other mechanisms that are being discussed right now. There's even a regional anti-corruption mechanism that actually there are a few proposals out there for regional anti-corruption mechanisms for the Northern Triangle. I suspect that those are going to get concretized probably pretty shortly. I think the US is likely to be a big supporter of those efforts. And so that's, one thing is like directly supporting the anti-corruption agenda. Another thing is all the Central American countries have different offices within the government that do anti-corruption work. You can support those. If there's one thing I've learned about anti-corruption stuff in recent years, in particular in the organized crime related anti-corruption activities, it's that there are incredibly good people in Central America who are trying to fight these battles. And I think figuring out how to support their efforts is key. And I think that what we're going to find is that there will be resources and a real willingness on the part of the State Department and USAID, other institutions to go to bat for those people and support their work. There are other anti-corruption things that language that can be put into aid legislation that it's called conditionality. Basically, it conditions aid on certain standards being met. That's another thing that can and I'm sure will be done. So there's more than one tool, and there are a bunch of tools in the anti-corruption toolkit that are there if you want to use them. And I think the Biden administration wants to use it, and I think Congress will support that.
When it comes specifically to El Salvador, do you think that those efforts involve working through the Bukele administration or around the Bukele administration?
Well, you could say the same thing about Honduras as well, right? This is really hard stuff. I think sometimes it means within and sometimes it means around. There are anti-corruption mechanisms that are being discussed are not necessarily, they're independent of the government in some ways. Or completely. So some of it is working around the government. I also believe, though, with all governments, there are people in institutions that merit support, and so I think that it can be both. Is I guess what I'm trying to say. I think there's going to be a good deal of working around people in elected office.
Let's go to a couple of questions about border policy and immigration. So one is about Title 42, which is the policy used by the Trump administration to turn back would-be asylum seekers on the basis of public health concerns surrounding COVID. I guess the idea is that people might bring COVID with them to detention facilities, which could run rampant. Do you see that Title 42 ending at any point, and how could that be done safely?
You could end it by testing. I think. My view is that they're keeping Title 42 in place because they want to have a controlled reopening of the asylum process in the United States. I think that's what they're doing. And so I see the the Title 42 restrictions as being used as a political tool more than as a public health tool right now. And that if they wanted to lift them, they could, and they could do it responsibly by, making sure that testing was in place.
And keeping on this sort of theme or something related, what do you think about, what do you think the deportation policy will be under the Biden administration? We have sort of a rocky history here. Many will remember that Obama was sort of slammed with the title deporter in chief because he really increased the number of deportations. But my understanding is that it was explicitly limited to people who had records as violent criminals. I'm not totally sure about that. Maybe you can correct me. But that under the Trump administration, it was sort of open season on anybody without documents. What do you expect under the Biden administration?
Well, I think we're already beginning to see that the Biden administration is going to deport people too. This is not an open borders policy that they're going about establishing, but I think they're going about they've already laid out the concept for legalizing 11 million people in the United States, right? They're looking at they are attempting to get the DACA kids finally on a path to citizenship, people with TPS, temporary protected status, on a path to citizenship. Before, if somebody who had DACA had a traffic violation, they could end up getting deported. I mean, I think that kind of enforcement is not going to be the focus of this administration. That doesn't mean that they just open the border and are going to let everybody in, but I think that enforcement will be prioritized in a really different way.
There's been a fair amount of talk about the administrative capacity to process asylum seekers and to give people fair hearings, and that capacity was significantly undermined by the Trump administration. I personally don't have a really good sense of what it would take to create enough administrative capacity in that system. I mean, is it even feasible? And can you imagine a timeline where we get to this orderly and regular process, at least with respect to really sort of hearing these cases in a quick enough way and giving people fair decisions?
I think that this has been the central issue on the table for the past couple of decades, and I find it mind-boggling that that it's taken us this long is it going to be complicated? Yes. Will it be difficult? Will there be a startup time? Do you have to train new judges? Do you have to, does there need to be greater access to legal services in the border areas where there's not enough right now? Yes. But all of those are solvable problems. I mean, I think that is one of my great frustrations with all of this. We could have a system whereby people who, especially people who approach the border and want to apply for political asylum, could get their cases heard in a reasonable amount of time without being, put into long-term immigration detention, and they could have access to legal services and have their cases determined. Not everybody's going to get political asylum, but we can have a legitimate law and a process in place whereby people are fairly heard in a reasonable amount of time. But it requires the dedication of time and resources. And I mean, this is one of the things that kind of drives me crazy, because you see the US willing over and over and over again to do things like send the National Guard to the border, or spend money on construction of the wall, when I think that, constructing a fair and orderly process, that this would be a place to spend the money, to spend some money and put a system in place that actually both works in terms of flow of migration, works in terms of fairness and international law. Yeah, it doesn't have to be, yeah, this isn't, I think we've been presented with these stark choices of, it's either we let everybody in, or we, have this is not a question of, you can set up something that actually works, that's not about just letting everyone who wants to come into the country at any time they choose. We've been set up with all these false choices. And one thing that I think is going to be really important in thinking about migration from Central America to the US in this next period are legal pathways to migration. I think one of the things that has been really cut off and that wasn't good during the Obama administration. So I think it's one of these issues that's not, Republican Democratic, but needs to be rethought, are legal pathways to migration for people who are just looking for work, not just asylum seekers. And also then when people really need refuge, when people are sought after by gangs or really in jeopardy, that they need to be able to get resettled if that's what they need, like from Central America to the United States, without them having to, go illegally across Mexico and present themselves at the border. I think there have to be legal processes through which you can do this.
A couple of the questions we have relate to a debate that you hear in the US about the push versus pull factors in spurring immigration, or emigration, I guess, when it comes to push, and immigration when it comes to pull. And so, if you listen to forces on the right in the US, there's a lot of talk about the message that's sent in policy. Right, and that Trump sends a hardline message, and that is somehow a deterrent, and that Biden sends a different kind of message, and that's somehow inviting. And then there are other voices, particularly on the left, that highlight the push factors and say, really, it has to do with the problems in countries, primarily in Central America these days, because they're the countries that are sending most immigrants. And you named one of them, a tantalizing hypothesis about corruption leading to hopelessness, leading to people deciding to leave, obviously security threats and general economic instability. And so how would you put this together, this sort of the balance of push versus pull, and how might that reflect in the optimum policy package? I know this is a broad question, but maybe just a few comments on what would be best. It's just so hard to kind of figure out what should be done. If you were in charge, what would you be doing?
Well, this is what everybody wants to know, right? What's the push versus pull factors? Because I think we figure if we could come up with a mathematical equation that told us how much is push, how much is pull, then we would jigger different things and voila, the system would work. I think that, there are legitimate push and pull factors that we all know and we've talked about for years, from family reunification in the US to wage differentials with Central America, to crime and violence in the region and lack of jobs. And I think that when people migrate, it's an individual decision. And so it's about how that person is experiencing their life and the options before them. So I just wrote a paper which was trying to let's see if I can do this really briefly, but it was trying to look at some of the happiness indicators. There's a whole science on the study of happiness, right? But I was really looking at the concept of hopelessness. Because as I had interviewed migrants over the past couple of years, there was just this undertone of the idea that nothing in their country is going to change and that government doesn't work, like government doesn't think about them, right? Government's not there to in any way make their lives better. And that was this undercurrent in discussions that my husband and I were both having in interviewing migrants. And we decided to write this paper, which was just published on hopelessness and corruption. And that I think that these corruption issues are linked to migration in a way that's not talked about very much, because I think endemic corruption is creating an environment in which people don't have the expectation that things are going to change. And I guess that's what I keep coming back to, as I was talking about before, the concept of legal pathways to migration. So, if you're in Central America, are there legal ways for you to migrate? That's right now, not much, really. I mean, there are very, very few. If you are desperate in need of assistance, is there a way for you to do it without just fleeing, kind of running for the nearest exit? Is there a way that you can go through a process and find protection? I think we've got to start establishing some things that are normal and orderly. And I guess that's why, if there's one concept that the Biden people are talking about that rings true with me, it's that when we begin to put those kinds of processes in place, that that there will be options. Right now, there just aren't. There aren't many options. So yeah. So that didn't really answer your question, but that's the best I can do.
It was an unanswerable question by design. So legal pathways, sort of an interesting idea came from AMLO in yesterday's meeting, maybe a surprising one. It sounded as if he was proposing a new bracero-style guest worker program. At least that makes some sense for Mexico these days, not for Central American countries so much. Do you see that as a possible program that the U.S. might pursue?
It all depends on how things are defined. I think temporary workers are temporary workers are incredibly important to the functioning of the agricultural economy and certain other economies here in the United States. There have been problems with access to temporary workers in the US for employers for years now. I think figuring out how to provide pathways to employment, temporary or permanent, in ways that are really respectful of the labor rights of those involved. Let's see. I think it's something definitely worth talking about, but a lot's gonna depend on how it's structured.
And then a question about Mexico's southern border, and maybe this is going to be our last one because we're coming up on 1:15. You mentioned in your remarks that AMLO ended up using the National Guard to sort of militarize the southern border with Guatemala in a way that hadn't been done before. It seemed to be under pressure from the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering to what extent it was, rather than something that AMLO was interested in doing, but appreciated the cover that he got from Trump's pressure plan. And now some concern perhaps in the AMLO administration that Biden's sort of new, at least rhetoric, would undermine that effort. And Mexico then becomes a pass-through point for increased numbers of migrants coming from Central America.
The question about the National Guard to the border. I mean, it was AMLO who sent the National Guard to the border. So he made that decision for his own reasons. The US was definitely pressuring to make that happen. AMLO distinctly had a different policy on migration prior to that point, which was this stated policy of not treating migrants as, illegals, but as human beings who were migrating. So some of both, but there was a policy change that took place there. Does Mexico, want to control or regularize migration through Mexico? I'm sure they'd like to have a better handle on it, just like every country does. Mexico is accepting many, many more Central American asylum seekers than it did just a couple of years ago. Their system has, as the US has restricted the application for asylum here in the United States, many more Central Americans have chosen to stay in Mexico and request asylum there, and their asylum system has really ramped up. But yeah, I think that it is not right to think that Mexico is just subject to the whims of the decisions of the United States. Mexico is a sovereign, independent actor here. I think that Mexico makes its decisions, based on what it wants to do, but not devoid of the relationship with the United States either. And the relationship, it isn't an asymmetric relationship. So pressures from here can have disproportionate influence at times.
I think we've reached the end of our allotted time. Thank you so much for these really, really insightful comments on a wide range of issues. There are very few people who could really speak across all these issues and so efficiently and rapidly as we throw questions at you about a variety of subjects. So thank you so much. And I also want to make sure to thank Allison Prince and Carolyn Dockery at the Strauss Center, the sponsor of today's event, for putting things together and making sure everything has run very smoothly. And thank you all for joining us. Please be aware of upcoming Strauss Center events. There are many throughout the rest of the academic year, and they're all as wonderful as this one has been.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.